The stagecoach rattled to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust. The weary sigh of its brakes, the only sound that seemed to welcome Clara Mae Thompson back to Redemption Gulch. She clutched the handle of her single, battered valise, its leather worn smooth by hands that had once held hope. Now, they only held the tremor of grief. As she stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of the town's only street, she felt the eyes of Redemption Gulch fall upon her like a physical weight. They were cold, curious, and sharp as flint. This was the place her husband, Josiah, had called home, the place he'd brought her to with promises of a future forged from the gold hidden in the unforgiving hills. Now, Josiah was gone, swallowed by the very earth he'd sought to conquer, and the town felt as alien as a distant star. Redemption Gulch was little more than a scar on the vast, sun-scorched landscape. A single main street lay gasping under the oppressive glare of the afternoon sun, flanked by a dozen or so clapboard buildings whose paint had long since surrendered to the relentless wind and sand. To her left, the blacksmith's hammer rang out with a lonely, rhythmic clang, a heartbeat for a town that otherwise seemed to be holding its breath. To her right, the bat-wing doors of the saloon, the dusty spur, swung open to release a gust of stale ale and rough laughter, which died the moment the men inside saw her. Further down, past the general store, a small church stood with its steeple aimed at the brassy sky. Its bell tower rusted the color of dried blood. This was it, the sum of her world now. A dry wind whipped down the street, kicking up dust that stung her eyes and tasted of grit and finality. It was a wind that carried whispers. Clara heard them as she walked, her worn-out boots scuffing a quiet path toward the small house at the edge of town. The whispers followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. A pair of women in bonnets, standing outside the mercantile, fell silent as she approached, their conversation resuming in hushed, urgent tones the moment she passed. Unnatural, the way that shaft collapsed. Heard they only found pieces of him. It's a bad omen. Her coming back. A widow sours the vein. My PA always said. The words were barbs, each one finding a place in the raw, open wound of her loss. They believed Josiah's death in the mine was no accident, but they didn't blame a faulty timber or a shift in the rock. They blamed her, his widow, a harbinger of misfortune. She tightened her grip on her valise, her knuckles white. She had come back hoping for a piece of the life she'd lost, a place to mourn, but found she'd returned to a jury that had already passed its sentence. Her first stop was Gable's General Store, a necessity she couldn't avoid. The bell above the door gave a cheerless jingle as she entered. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured meats, and dried lavender. Mrs. Gable stood behind the counter, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval. Her eyes, small and dark, swept over Clara's simple black dress and dusty luggage. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said, her voice thin and sharp. "Didn't expect to see you back." "I need some supplies. Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. She placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle of coins on the counter. It was nearly all she had left. Flour, salt, some coffee, and a bar of soap. "Mrs. Gable picked through the items with slow, deliberate movements. Her lips pursed. She weighed the flour, her thumb pressing down on the scale just enough to add an extra ounce. When she named the price, it was a full third more than it should have been. Clara's jaw tightened. "That seems high." "Prices have gone up. Hard times." "Mrs." Gable said flatly, her gaze unwavering. It was a lie, and they both knew it. It was a tax for her presence, a penalty for her grief, swallowing her pride, which felt like swallowing shards of glass. Clara counted out the coins. She left the store with a half-empty sack and a heart full of cold fury, the bell's jingle sounding like a mocking laugh behind her. The house was just as she'd left it, but worse. It was a small, sad-looking cabin that slumped as if tired of standing against the wind. A fine layer of dust coated everything, ghosting the furniture Josiah had built with his own hands. Cobwebs draped the corners of the single room like funeral shrouds. Clara set down her sack and valise and simply stood there, breathing in the stale air of a dead dream. Cleaning was a kind of prayer, a way to fight back against the encroaching despair. She swept the floors, scrubbed the small window until the light could pierce the grime, and aired out the musty linens. It was while clearing out a small wooden chest at the foot of the bed that her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. Prying it up, she found a small, hidden space beneath. Inside lay a single, folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in Josiah's familiar, hurried script. It was torn at the bottom and stained with what looked like axle grease. It had never been sent. "My dearest Clara," it began. "Things are getting worse here. That debt collector from Sacramento, the one I told you about, grows more impatient by the day. He and his men, they aren't the kind you say no to. I've found something in the West Seam, something big, bigger than I ever let on, but I fear I can't hold on to it. I have a plan. If it works, we can escape this place for good. Pack what you can carry. Be ready to leave at a moment's notice. If I'm not back by Sunday, don't wait. Just go, if they find out what I'm planning." The rest of the letter was torn away. Clara sank to the floor, the paper trembling in her hand. A debt collector? An escape plan. Josiah had never spoken of such desperate things. He'd only spoken of their future, of building a life. The town's whispers of an unnatural death now echoed in her mind with a terrifying new weight. This paper was proof that he had been afraid, that he had been hiding something. Her meager savings wouldn't last a week. The next morning, Clara set out to find work. She was a fine seamstress and a hard worker, willing to do laundry, mending, anything. But every door was a quiet rejection. One woman claimed her husband wouldn't abide bad luck in the house. Another promised her a day's worth of mending, only to pay her a pittance, claiming the stitches were uneven. She was being starved out, pushed out by a wall of silent, unified contempt. Late that afternoon, as Clara was walking back from another fruitless attempt to find work, her head bowed against the wind, a new figure rode into town. He was a tall man on a powerful buckskin horse, both horse and rider coated in the dust of a long journey. His face was tanned by the sun, lined by squinting into 1,000 empty horizons. A low-slung hat shadowed his eyes, but he moved with a weary grace that spoke of hard miles. He dismounted in front of the dusty spur, tied his horse to the rail, and pushed through the batwing doors. From the saloon's cool darkness, he ordered a whiskey and watched the sun-blasted street through the window, his gaze settling for a moment on the lonely figure in black walking toward the edge of town. He didn't know her story, but he recognized the look of a person fighting a battle all on their own. Later, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Clara was trying to nail a loose shutter back into place. Her hands were clumsy with fatigue, and she dropped the hammer with a frustrated sigh. A voice, low and calm, startled her. "Need a hand with that?" She spun around. It was the stranger from the saloon. He was standing just a few feet away, his hat in his hands. His eyes, now visible in the fading light, were a clear, steady gray. They held none of the judgment or pity she had grown so accustomed to. They simply saw her. I can manage," she stammered, flustered. He nodded, not pressing the issue. "Forgive me for bothering you. Ma'am, I was wondering about that shack next door," he said, gesturing with his hat toward the dilapidated structure beside her own. "Looks abandoned. I need a place to stay for the night that isn't over that saloon. I'd be obliged to pay for the use of its roof." Clara stared at him. It was a simple, practical request, delivered without pretense. For the first time since she'd returned, someone was speaking to her not as a widow, not as a curse, but as a person. "It's empty," she finally managed to say, No one will mind." "Thank you, ma'am." He gave a slight tip of his head, his gaze lingering on her for just a second longer. In that brief moment, in that quiet, unassuming stare, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, the unnerving sensation of being seen, not as a symbol of death and misfortune, but simply as a woman, alone, trying to fix a broken shutter as the world grew dark around her. The realization was so unexpected it sent a jolt right through her. He turned and led his horse toward the shack, and Clara was left standing on her porch, the hammer forgotten in her hand, her heart beating just a little too fast. The next morning, a thin column of smoke rose from the chimney of the dilapidated shack. Clara, sweeping the dust from her own porch, watched the stranger emerge. He moved with an economy of motion, checking on his horse before splashing water on his face from a canteen. When he saw her, he nodded a greeting. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. He walked over, stopping a respectful distance away. "Name's Eli Vance. I appreciate you letting me use the shelter." "Clara Thompson," she replied, her voice soft. It was no trouble. "I aim to be in the area a few days," he explained, his gaze drifting toward the rolling, empty plains beyond the town. "Looking to see about a parcel of land. A man needs a place to put down roots, sooner or later." There was a finality in his tone, the sound of a man who had been wandering for a long time. Their conversation was cut short by a sudden, violent gust of wind that howled down from the hills. It rattled the windows and tore at the loose shutter Eli had seen the night before. Inside Clara's cabin, the wind found its way down the poorly sealed chimney flue. A sudden roar, followed by the acrid smell of thick smoke, billowed from her open doorway. Clara gasped and rushed inside. A rogue ember, blown from the hearth, had landed on a dish towel she'd left too close to the cast-iron stove. Flames were already licking at the dry wooden wall behind it. For a heart-stopping second, she froze, panic seizing her limbs. Before she could scream, Eli was there. He moved past her in 2 long strides, grabbing the half-full water bucket by the door. With a single, decisive motion, he doused the flames. Sizzling, hissing smoke filled the small cabin, but the danger was over. He tossed the smoldering rag outside and stood for a moment, his back to her, surveying the blackened patch on the wall. "You all right, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the chaos of the last minute. Clara could only nod, her hand pressed to her throat where her heart hammered like a trapped bird. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Vance. It happened so fast." "Wind in these parts has a mean streak," he said, turning to face her. His gray eyes held a flicker of concern. "No harm done. Looks like just a bit of soot." He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He smelled of dust, leather, and the clean scent of the open range. That small fire burned away a layer of formality between them. A few days later, Eli was still in town, negotiating with the land office, and their paths continued to cross. He saw firsthand the wall of ice the town had built around her. At the weekly market, a small collection of carts and tables in the center of town, he watched as Clara tried to buy a loaf of bread from a baker. "That'll be 5 cents. The baker, a heavy-set man named Henderson, grunted, his eyes refusing to meet hers. 5 cents? Clara's voice was a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "Yesterday it was 2. "Flowers, dear. Take it or leave it." He began to turn away, a dismissive shrug of his broad shoulders. Before Clara could answer, Eli stepped forward, his shadow falling over the cart. He placed 2 pennies on the baker's table. "A loaf is 2 cents, he said, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. He wasn't loud, but his quiet intensity made the baker turn back, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. For a moment, Henderson seemed ready to argue, but something in Eli's steady gaze made him reconsider. with a sullen expression. He pushed the loaf of bread toward Clara and swept the 2 coins into his apron. Eli nodded once to Clara, then walked away without another word. She clutched the warm bread to her chest, her face burning with a mixture of shame and a strange, unfamiliar flutter of gratitude. No one had stood up for her, not once. Their interactions became a quiet language of their own. One afternoon, he saw her struggling to haul buckets of water from the town well. The next morning, she woke to find her own water barrel, which had been nearly empty, filled to the brim. The day after, he noticed the leak in her roof when a sun shower passed through. By evening, he had climbed up with a handful of shingles he'd bought and mended the spot, working silently as the sun went down. Clara, in turn, felt a need to repay these kindnesses. She couldn't offer money, but she could offer skill. She mended a tear in his canvas jacket, the stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. And one afternoon, seeing him cleaning his saddle, she brought out a soft, clean piece of cotton cloth. "For your saddle," she said simply. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The brief contact sent a warmth spreading up her arm. "Thank you, Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. They spoke of the weather. They spoke of his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil. They spoke of the small things that filled the empty spaces. But their words were just placeholders for the real conversation happening in the glances, the small gestures, the shared silence. One night, the loneliness pressed in on Clara with a physical weight. She sat by her small hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, and hummed a tune without thinking, a soft, melancholic ballad Josiah used to love. Her voice was quiet, fragile, meant only for the ghosts in the room. Outside, in the darkness of his shack, Eli heard it. The faint melody drifted through the thin walls, a thread of pure, unvarnished sorrow. He stood by his window for a long time, just listening. The next day, he found her tending to a small, struggling patch of herbs she was trying to grow by her door. "That was a pretty song you were singing last night," he said gently. Clara's head snapped up, a blush rising on her cheeks. "You heard that?" "Just a little," sounded sad. She looked down at her hands, twisting a stray weed. "It was my husband's favorite." The words hung in the air between them. Eli didn't speak. He just waited, giving her the space to continue if she chose. "They told me the mine collapsed," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They said he went missing for 2 days. When they finally found him, the sheriff said his body was broken, as if he'd been beaten, not just crushed by rock." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a pain and confusion she hadn't dared to voice to anyone else. "Does that sound right to you, Mr. Vance, for a cave-in?" Eli considered her words, his expression grim. He had seen his share of death in the West. "No, ma'am," he said honestly. "It doesn't." "Who were you before you came here?" she asked, a sudden need to know more about the man who listened without judgment. A shadow passed over Eli's face, brief but definite. He looked away, toward the distant hills. "I worked a cattle ranch down in the territories," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "There was some trouble. The owner wasn't an honest man. I left." He offered no more, and his tone made it clear she shouldn't ask. Everyone in the West had a past they were riding away from. His was just closer to the surface than most. A few days later, the fragile peace she had begun to feel was shattered. When she went to fetch water in the morning, she saw them, footprints in the soft earth at the back of her cabin. They weren't her delicate tracks, nor were they Eli's familiar boot prints. These were made by a large, heavy man wearing boots with worn-down heels. The tracks led from the direction of the hills, circled her small home, paused for a long time directly beneath her only window, and then retreated the way they came. Someone had been watching her. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized her. It was the faceless fear from Josiah's letter made real. that debt collector. She spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind. She barred her door as soon as the sun began to set, her heart pounding with a primal terror. As dusk settled, Eli rode past her cabin on his way back from the land office. He was leading Dust Devil, his day's business done. He saw the bar across her door, the way the curtains were drawn tight when she always left them open to catch the evening breeze. He saw the single, flickering light of her lamp through a small crack. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. Then he saw them, the same heavy footprints in the dust, stark and menacing in the fading light. He didn't knock on her door. He didn't call out to her. He knew words would be useless against that kind of fear. Instead, he led his horse to the side of her cabin, unsaddled him for the night, and then took his bedroll and his rifle. He walked up the 3 steps to her small porch, settled himself with his back against her door, and pulled his hat down low. He didn't plan to sleep. He would be her vigil, a silent guardian against the encroaching darkness. Eli's presence on her porch was a double-edged sword. When Clara unbarred her door the next morning to find him rolling up his bedroll, a wave of profound relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She had not been alone. But when she saw the looks on the faces of the few people who were out at that early hour, she understood that his protection had come at a cost. Redemption Gulch was a town that thrived on speculation, and the sight of the quiet strangers sleeping on the widow's porch was a feast for hungry imaginations. The narrative was written before the sun was fully over the hills. The whispers that had once called her a bad omen now took on a sharper, more vicious edge. They painted her as a temptress, a black widow luring a new man into her web before her husband was even cold in his unmarked grave. The venom found its voice in the town's self-appointed moral authorities, the church-going wives, led by Martha Gable, the merchant's wife. A delegation of 3 women paid a visit to Reverend Miller. They found him tending the small, struggling garden behind the church, and they did not mince words. "Reverend, it is a disgrace," Mrs. Gable began, her hands clasped tightly over her stomach. "That Thompson woman, she has a man sleeping on her porch, like some common alley cat. She's bringing shame on this whole community," added Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife. "My husband says men are talking about it in the saloon. It's unseemly." Reverend Miller, a thin, tired man whose faith was constantly tested by the hardness of the land and the people in it, sighed and wiped his hands on his trousers. Eli Vance is a quiet man. He is renting the shack next door. Perhaps there is an innocent explanation. "Innocent?" Mrs. Gable scoffed. "There is nothing innocent about a widow taking up with a drifter before the mourning period is even a memory. She is a stain on this town. We are asking you, as our spiritual guide, to forbid her from entering the house of the Lord. Her presence defiles it." The demand hung in the dry air. Banning a soul from church was a profound condemnation, a spiritual exile that would make her a complete outcast. The Reverend looked from one hard, determined face to the next. He knew it was wrong, but he also knew the power these women held over the town's social fabric. He promised to consider it, a weak answer that satisfied no one but bought him time. Eli heard the talk. He wasn't a man for gossip, but he was a man who listened. He heard it in the way the bartender's questions became more pointed. He saw it in the smirks of the men lounging outside the blacksmith's. The final proof came on market day. He had finished his business at the land office and was walking down the main street when he saw Clara ahead of him. She was trying to walk the gauntlet, her head held high, a basket on her arm, but the townspeople treated her as if she were a leper. They parted before her, conversation stopping, only to resume in venomous whispers as she passed. Men stared at her with a new, leering curiosity. Women pulled their children closer, their faces masks of contempt. Each step she took seemed to require a monumental effort, a battle against an invisible, crushing force. A cold anger, slow and deep, began to burn in Eli's gut. He had seen cruelty of all kinds, but this petty, self-righteous persecution of a woman already burdened by grief struck a nerve. He lengthened his stride, catching up to her. He didn't say a word. He simply fell into step beside her. His presence was an immediate declaration. He was tall, armed, and carried an aura of quiet capability that discouraged casual insult. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they faltered. The leering stares turned into quick, uncertain glances. Eli's gaze swept over the crowd, flat and challenging. He was a shield, and everyone knew it. Clara flinched when he first appeared at her side, her body tensing for a blow that didn't come. She dared a glance up at him. His face was set, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but she knew he was doing this for her. A hot blush of shame crept up her neck. She was the cause of this, the source of the trouble that now clung to this quiet stranger. But beneath the shame, a different emotion stirred. A fragile, trembling thing she hadn't felt in a year. It was the feeling of not being utterly alone. Her steps became a little steadier. For the first time, someone was walking with her through the fire. That night, the sky turned the color of a bruise. The wind that had been a constant nagging presence for days began to build into a furious, shrieking gale. Dust and debris flew through the air, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, striking the hard-baked earth with sounds like pistol shots. Eli had spent the last 2 days building a small, 3-sided lean-to for Dust Devil, a simple shelter to keep the worst of the sun and rain off his horse. But it was no match for the storm. Clara, watching from her window, saw the wind catch the makeshift roof. It lifted, held for a terrifying second, and then tore away, the planks cartwheeling into the darkness. A moment later, the remaining walls collapsed with a splintering crack. The rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and the world outside her window was a chaos of wind and water. She thought of Eli in his drafty, crumbling shack. She thought of his horse, standing unsheltered in the deluge. Her heart ached for them both. Minutes later, a heavy knock sounded on her door. It was a solid, desperate sound, barely audible over the roar of the storm. Her heart leaped into her throat. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the bar. The town's whispers echoed in her mind. What would they say now? But then she thought of the man who had stood beside her in the market, who had guarded her door, who was now caught in a tempest. She lifted the bar and pulled the door open. Eli stood on her porch, soaked to the skin. Rain streamed from the brim of his hat and plastered his shirt to his chest. His horse stood behind him, shivering and miserable. "Ma'am," he shouted over the wind. "My apologies. My shelter, it's gone. Would you have a spot in your shed, just for the horse? He can't stay out in this." Her shed was little more than a closet, barely big enough for firewood and tools. "Bring him in here," she said, her decision made in an instant. Inside the house, he stared at her, stunned. "Clara, I can't bring a horse into your—" "It's warmer and drier than my shed," she insisted, pulling the door wider. "There's no time to argue. Get him in." It was a clumsy, chaotic affair, but they managed to coax the frightened animal into the small cabin. Dust Devil stood dripping and steaming in the center of the room, his eyes wide, taking up nearly all the available space. Eli removed his saddle and began rubbing him down with a dry sack. When he was done, they were left in an awkward silence, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the horse's nervous snorts. I'll just wait on the porch until it eases up," Eli said, turning to go. "Don't be foolish," Clara said, her voice firm. "You'll catch your death. Sit by the fire. I'll make coffee." He relented, slumping into the single wooden chair by the hearth, dripping water onto the floorboards. Clara busied herself with the fire and the coffee pot, the mundane tasks a welcome distraction from the overwhelming presence of the man and the horse in her home. She found a piece of cornbread left over from the day before. slightly burnt at the edges, and broke it in two, handing him a piece on a tin plate. They ate in silence, the warmth of the fire slowly chasing the chill from the room. Eli's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where she had placed Josiah's tattered letter. He stared at it for a long moment. "Is that what you found?" he asked quietly. "Under the floorboards?" Clara nodded, her throat tight. His eyes asked the question his voice didn't. With a trembling hand, she picked it up and gave it to him. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. But when he got to the end, to the torn, final sentences, he went utterly still. He read the words aloud, his voice a low, grim murmur. "If they find out what I'm planning, if I don't make it back, they will bury my body in the mine." He looked up from the paper, his gray eyes boring into hers. The casual warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, hard intensity. "Who are they? Clara?" She shook her head, a familiar wave of helplessness washing over her. "I don't know. He never said. He only ever mentioned one name, a debt collector from Sacramento." The storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil that had suddenly entered the small cabin. The air was thick with unspoken questions and shared danger. Eli folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames. Shivering slightly from the lingering dampness, Clara pulled a worn wool blanket from the chest at the foot of her bed. "Here," she said, offering it to him. "You're still cold." As he reached out to take it, his fingers brushed against hers. It was an accident, a fleeting, momentary contact of his calloused, weather-roughened skin against her own. But it felt like a bolt of lightning, a shock that had nothing to do with the storm. It was a spark of heat, of life, of a connection that went far beyond gratitude or pity. They both pulled their hands back as if burned. Their eyes met and held. In that instant, across the small space that separated them, everything changed. The carefully constructed walls of propriety, of grief and caution, crumbled. They saw in each other's eyes a mirror of their own loneliness, a flicker of a desperate, long-suppressed need. It was a raw, vulnerable, and terrifying recognition. Something had been held in check for weeks, and in that one accidental touch, the dam had finally broken. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of damp earth and sage. The morning sun steamed the moisture from the ground, and in that fragile, renewed light, a partnership was forged. Clara refused to let Eli rebuild his horse's shelter alone. She had no skill with a hammer, but she could hold a plank steady, fetch nails, and pass him tools. They worked side by side under the vast, blue sky. The easy rhythm of their labor became a conversation in itself. There was a simple, profound trust in the way he'd reach back for the hammer without looking, knowing her hand would be there to place it in his. There was an unspoken care in the way she'd bring him a dipper of cool water from her barrel, her fingers brushing his as he took it. They were two solitary figures creating something together, a small bulwark against the vast, uncaring wilderness. In the shared effort of sawing wood and driving nails, some of the tension that had sparked between them the night before eased into a quiet, comfortable hum of companionship. He was no longer just the stranger in the shack next door. He was Eli, and to him, she was no longer the tragic widow. She was Clara. But peace, for Clara, was a fleeting guest. The past was a relentless hunter, and it found her in the deepest watches of the night. She dreamt she was back in the mine. The air was thick and cold, smelling of rock dust and dampness. Lantern light flickered, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced on the walls of the narrow tunnel. She called out for Josiah, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then she saw him. He stood at the far end of the tunnel, not as the vibrant, laughing man she remembered, but as a spectral figure, his clothes torn and caked with mud, his face obscured by shadow. "Josiah?" she whispered, her dream voice trembling. He didn't answer. He simply raised a hand and pointed an accusatory finger at her. A voice that was his and yet not his echoed in the chasm of her mind. "You are forgetting me. Clara, you are letting him erase me." She tried to run to him, to explain, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The walls of the mine began to tremble, and rocks began to fall. She opened her mouth to scream, and the sound that came out was a raw, guttural sob of pure anguish. Clara awoke with that sob still caught in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat, tears streaming down her face. The dream felt so real, the accusation so piercing, that for a moment she was lost, drowning in a sea of grief and guilt. A floorboard creaked on her porch. Her head snapped toward the door. In the pale moonlight filtering through her window, she saw a silhouette. It was Eli. He was standing just outside her open doorway, which she had left ajar for the warm night air. He wasn't intruding, just standing witness, his expression unreadable in the shadows. He had heard everything. The shame was immediate and overwhelming. She pulled the thin sheet up to her chin, trying to hide. "Go away," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. He didn't leave. Instead, he took one slow step into the room. It was just a dream. "Clara, you don't understand," she wept, the words tumbling out. "He thinks I'm forgetting him. He thinks I'm betraying him." Eli was silent for a long time. Then he walked to the hearth and stirred the dying embers, coaxing a small flame back to life. He didn't look at her. "My PA died when I was 16, he said, his voice low and soft. "Fever. For a year after. Every time I laughed, I felt like I was spitting on his grave. Guilt is a ghost that feeds on memory. You can't kill it. You just have to learn to live alongside it." He turned to face her, the gentle firelight catching the lines on his face. "You're not forgetting him. Clara, you're just surviving. There's no sin in that." His words, simple and true, were a balm on her raw nerves. The terrible weight in her chest seemed to lessen, just a fraction. She watched him, the way the firelight played across the strong lines of his back. For the first time, she noticed the network of scars that crisscrossed his shoulders, pale lines against his tanned skin. One scar was different, a thick, ugly welt that ran from just below his shoulder blade down toward his ribs. It was old, but it spoke of a deep and terrible violence. "What happened to your back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He tensed, his shoulders tightening. He looked away, his jaw working. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Trouble I told you about," he said finally. His voice strained. "The rancher I worked for. He was branding his neighbor's cattle, changing the marks, stealing them blind. The neighbor was a small man with a family. I saw what was happening." He paused, taking a breath. "I spoke up, testified to the marshal. The rancher had money, friends. The marshal was in his pocket. They called me a liar. The night before I was set to leave the territory, 3 of his men came for me. They dragged me from the bunkhouse." He turned his head slightly, and his eyes met hers in the dim light. They were dark with a memory he rarely revisited. "They threw a rope over the branch of a cottonwood tree, meant to hang me as a warning to anyone else with a conscience. The rope, it wasn't tied right. It slipped, dropped me hard, broke a few ribs and gave me this." He gestured vaguely toward his back. "By the time they hauled me up again, a real patrol, out looking for rustlers, rode into the camp. The men scattered." Clara stared at him, horrified. The quiet, capable man who had guarded her porch had been moments from death for the simple act of telling the truth. "I left the next morning," he finished, his voice flat. "Decided I was done fighting other men's battles, done getting involved. I didn't plan on loving anyone or anything again. It's safer that way." He stood up and walked toward her, stopping at the foot of her bed. The small room felt charged, the air thick with confessions and old wounds. "But then I came to this town," he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it. "And I saw you, standing all alone against everyone. And when I look at you, Clara, I think of home. Not a place I've ever lived, but a place I'd want to come back to. A place I'd want to protect." The raw honesty of his words stripped the air from her lungs. A violent tremor ran through her. This man, with his own ghosts and his own deep scars, saw a home in her. She was a ruin, a bad omen, a pariah, but he saw a home. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. He moved to sit on the edge of the bed, not close enough to be improper, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, two damaged souls finding a fragile sanctuary in the dead of night. The space between them hummed with a powerful, unspoken current. Slowly, as if moving against a great weight, he lifted his hand and gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was reverent, hesitant. Then he leaned in and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of comfort, of benediction, a promise. But it was too much. That simple, gentle touch was the spark that ignited the tinder of weeks of pent-up emotion. The grief, the loneliness, the fear, and the burgeoning, terrifying hope all coalesced into a single, overwhelming need. Clara's control shattered. A sound that was half sob, half gasp escaped her lips, and she turned her face into his chest, her hands clutching at his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. His arms came around her, pulling her into an embrace that was fierce and desperate. His hand tangled in her hair, tilting her face up to his. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss born of desperation and solace, a raw, hungry collision of two people starved for connection. It tasted of salt from her tears and the rain from the storm. All the careful boundaries they had built vanished in a rush of heat and sensation. His hands moved from her hair to her back, pulling her closer, and hers clung to his shoulders, holding on for dear life. It was a fever, a whirlwind that swept them both away. The unspoken longings of quiet glances and accidental touches found their voice in the darkness, speaking a language of touch and breath and fierce, desperate need. It was a prayer and a blasphemy, a moment of profound solace and wrenching transgression, a fire they had both unknowingly been feeding, that now consumed them completely. The first gray light of dawn crept through the window, merciless and clear. Clara lay awake, listening to the steady, even breathing of the man sleeping beside her. The fever of the night had broken, leaving behind the cold, hard clarity of morning, and with it, a crushing wave of guilt. Eli stirred, his arm tightening around her waist in his sleep, in that simple, unconscious gesture of possession. The full weight of what she had done crashed down on her. She slipped from his grasp and out of the bed, pulling her robe tightly around her as if it could ward off the shame. She moved to the other side of the cabin, turning her back to him, her arms wrapped around herself. She heard him sit up. "Clara?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. She couldn't look at him. She stared at the rough-hewn wall, at the ghost of a man she had loved and lost. "This was a mistake," she whispered, her voice brittle. A silence stretched between them, heavy and cold. "I'm still another man's wife," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "In my heart, in God's eyes, I'm still his." The silence of the dawn was cold and unforgiving. Eli dressed quietly in the half-light, his movements economical and precise. He didn't try to speak, and Clara was grateful for it. Words were useless against the mountain of guilt and confusion that sat between them. When he stood at the door, he paused, his back to her. "I'll be back for my horse after sunup," he said, his voice low. He didn't want to be seen leaving her cabin at this hour, a gesture of discretion that was already too late. He stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, leaving Clara alone with the scent of him on her pillows and the full, crushing weight of her transgression. It did not take long for the town to pass its judgment. The baker's wife, Mrs. Henderson, was an early riser. She saw Eli emerge not from his own shack, but from the widow Thompson's cabin. Just as the sky was beginning to turn from gray to pink, she saw the set of his shoulders, the way he didn't look back. It was all the proof she needed. By the time the sun was fully up, the story had grown wings. It flew from back porch to front parlor, over fences and across the counter at Gable's general store. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a low, humming roar of indignation. The vague suspicion had solidified into hard, ugly certainty. Clara Thompson was not just a bad omen. She was a fallen woman. She had defiled the memory of her dead husband and brought sin into their midst. The calls began as murmurs and grew into a chorus. She had to go. A town like Redemption Gulch could tolerate hardship, thirst, and even violence, but it would not tolerate a stain on its public morality. The pressure fell squarely on the narrow shoulders of Reverend Miller. By mid-morning, his church was filled not with prayer, but with the angry buzzing of his congregation, demanding he take action. He sent a boy to fetch Eli Vance, requesting his presence in the church vestry. Eli found him standing beside a dusty window that overlooked the town's small, sad cemetery. The Reverend looked older than he had just days before. Mr. Vance, he began, his voice heavy with a weary sort of sorrow. I am a man of God, but I am also a member of this community. The things people are saying, they cannot be ignored. Eli's face was like stone. What are they saying, Reverend? The preacher had the decency to look uncomfortable. They are saying you spent the night in Mrs. Thompson's home. They are saying you have taken advantage of her grief, that you have compromised her honor. He wrung his hands, a nervous, agitated gesture. She is a widow, son, a vulnerable woman in a state of profound mourning. For you to dishonor her in such a way. A muscle jumped in Eli's jaw. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. The only dishonor that woman has suffered is at the hands of this town. You've treated her like a curse from the moment she arrived. You've starved her out, whispered behind her back, and judged her for the crime of being alone. Her honor is more intact than anyone else's in this whole miserable place. Be that as it may, the Reverend said, flustered by Eli's cold fury. The situation is untenable. People are demanding she be expelled from the town limits, for the sake of public decency. Eli stared at the preacher, and in his eyes, the Reverend saw a contempt so pure it made him take a step back. Decency, Eli repeated, the word an insult on his tongue. He turned and walked out of the vestry, his boots echoing in the cavernous silence of the empty church. He knew what he had to do. His timing was perfect, or perhaps fated. It was Sunday, and the morning service was just letting out. The congregation spilled from the church doors, blinking in the bright sunlight, the same men and women who had just been demanding Clara's exile. Clara was not among them, but Eli saw her walking down the far end of the street, heading back to her cabin, a small sack of flour her only purchase for the day. She was a solitary figure, the entire town a hostile sea parting around her. Eli strode to the bottom of the church steps, planting himself directly in the path of the emerging crowd. He waited until Mrs. Gable and her cohort were before him. I hear, he said, his voice ringing out with unnatural clarity, that you people have a problem with Mrs. Thompson. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. People shuffled to a halt, turning to stare. I hear you think she doesn't belong here, Eli continued, his gaze sweeping over their faces, challenging each and every one of them. I hear you want to throw her out. He let the accusation hang in the air, thick and undeniable. Then his eyes found Clara, who had frozen at the far end of the street, watching in horror. He raised his voice so that she, and everyone else, could hear him clear as the rusted church bell. Well, here's my answer to that. If this town doesn't want her, then I'll have her. I'll take her hand, and I will name her my bride. If she has no place here, then her place is with me. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a declaration of war, a public rebuke of their judgment. He had drawn a line in the dust and dared them to cross it. For Clara, the words were not a rescue, they were a branding. He had taken her most private shame and her deepest conflict and displayed them for the entire town to see. She turned and fled, her face burning, the small sack of flour clutched to her chest. Eli found her moments later at her cabin. She had thrown the sack on the table and was pacing the small room like a caged animal. "How dare you?" she hissed, whirling on him as he entered. "How dare you say that in front of them? In front of me?" "I was defending you," he said, his voice strained. "Defending me? You humiliated me. You made me into a charity case, a poor, dishonored widow that you would stoop to save out of pity." Her voice broke, thick with rage and unshed tears. "I am not some stray dog you can claim. Eli, I don't need you, or any man, to give me a place in this world." "Pity?" The word exploded from him, raw and wounded. He took 2 long strides, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly before her, his hands clenched at his sides. "You think this is about pity?" He reached out and gripped her shoulders, his hold firm but not rough. He forced her to look at him, to see the anguish in his eyes. "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you, Clara," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I'm doing this because I love you. Do you hear me? I love you, and I will not stand by and let these sanctimonious hypocrites insult you or harm you, not while I'm still drawing breath." The confession, so stark and absolute, shattered her anger, leaving a devastating silence in its wake. Love. It was a word she thought she would never hear again, a possibility she had buried with Josiah. To hear it now, from this man, in the midst of this chaos, was more than her heart could bear. The fight went out of her, and she began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. He pulled her against him, and this time she didn't resist, collapsing against his chest as he held her. "I can't," she wept into his shirt, the words muffled and thick with despair. "Eli, I can't." He held her, stroking her hair, his own heart aching. He had offered her his name, his protection, his love, and still, the ghost of her husband stood between them, a barrier he did not know how to break. She was still a prisoner of the past, and he didn't have the key to set her free. That night, Clara was alone. Eli had retreated to his shack, leaving her with the echoes of his declaration and the turmoil of her own heart. Sleep would not come. She sat by the cold hearth, staring into the darkness, her mind a battlefield of love and loyalty, guilt and longing. Sometime after midnight, a sound from outside brought her instantly alert. It was the soft crunch of a boot on the dry earth near her window. It was not Eli's familiar tread. Her blood ran cold. She remembered the other footprints, the feeling of being watched. She rose silently, her heart hammering against her ribs, and crept to the window. Peering through a small gap in the curtains, she saw nothing but moon-cast shadows. Then she heard it again, closer this time, a faint scraping sound at her door, followed by the metallic click of a knife being inserted into the gap between the door and the frame. Someone was jimmying the lock. Panic gave way to a surge of pure adrenaline. She wasn't a victim to be preyed upon. Not anymore. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its weight a solid, reassuring presence in her hand. The lock gave way with a soft crack, and the door swung silently inward. A large, dark figure slipped into the room, moving with a quiet confidence that spoke of practice. He took 2 steps inside, his back to her, pausing to let his eyes adjust to the gloom. In that moment, Clara acted. With a cry that was more fury than fear, she swung the poker with all her might, aiming for the intruder's head. He must have heard her intake of breath, because he ducked at the last second. The poker glanced off his shoulder with a dull thud, and he grunted in pain. Stumbling forward, he spun around, his face a mask of shock and fury in the moonlight. And in that instant, Clara recognized him. She had seen that broad, fleshy face before. He had been at Josiah's funeral, one of the anonymous, grim-faced miners who had stood at the back of the crowd, his eyes cold and watchful. The man didn't press his attack. He saw the wild, desperate look in her eyes, the poker held ready for another swing. He backed away, clutching his shoulder, his eyes darting around the cabin as if looking for something. But he hadn't found it. He slipped back out the door and broke into a run. Clara, acting on pure instinct, ran after him, chasing him out into the moonlit yard. He was faster, already disappearing into the shadows of the hills. But before he vanished, he stopped and turned back, a menacing silhouette against the pale rocks. "You should have stayed put, little widow," he snarled, his voice a low, gravelly threat that carried on the still night air. "Keep digging into things that don't concern you, and you'll end up in the mine, just like your husband." The threat struck her with the force of a physical blow. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara standing alone in the moonlight, the iron poker trembling in her hand, the man's final words echoing in the terrifying silence. The intruder's threat hung in the air long after he was gone, a poison that seeped into the very walls of the cabin. Clara stood frozen in the moonlight, the iron poker a useless weight in her hand. The fear was a physical thing, a block of ice in her stomach. But beneath it, something new and hard was beginning to form. Resolve. The faceless whispers of the town were one thing. This was a direct, tangible threat. A line drawn from her husband's death to her own doorstep. She didn't wait for dawn. She barred her door, lit a lamp, and sat with the poker across her lap until the first hint of gray appeared in the sky. Then, she walked across the dew-soaked ground to Eli's shack. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open. He was awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, cleaning his revolver. He looked up, and his face was grim. He had heard the commotion. "He was in my house," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the hysteria she felt. She told him everything, the recognition, the chase, the final, chilling words. Eli listened without interruption, his hands never ceasing their methodical work on his pistol. When she finished, he slid the cylinder back into place with a definitive click. "This isn't about a simple debt collector from Sacramento," he said, his voice hard as iron. "That was a story Josiah told you to keep you from worrying. This is organized, a syndicate, a claim-jumping outfit. They run on fear and they don't leave loose ends. That man wasn't there to rob you. He was looking for something. What was your husband working on before he died?" "His claim," Clara answered immediately. "The one everyone thought was played out. He spent all his time out there, in the Western Canyon." "Then that's where we go," Eli said, standing up. "They threatened you for digging. It's time we gave them something to worry about." They rode out an hour later, leaving the sleeping town behind them. The Western Canyon was a jagged gash in the earth, a place of sharp shadows and whispering winds. It was a place prospectors abandoned when their luck ran out, littered with the ghosts of failed dreams. After a half-hour ride, Clara pointed to a narrow, overgrown trail. "Down there?" Josiah's claim was little more than a crude timber frame supporting the entrance to a shallow mine shaft, tucked away behind a curtain of scree and thorny brush. It felt forgotten, a place of profound and sorrowful silence. A rusted pickaxe lay where it had been dropped. A dented tin cup sat on a rock. It was as if Josiah had just stepped away for a moment. "The man who threatened me," Clara said quietly. "He was looking for something he thought I had." "Josiah's letter," Eli said, his eyes scanning the area with a practiced intensity. "He mentioned he'd found something big. Maybe he wrote it down, a map, a deed." They began to search. It was a painstaking process, turning over rocks, checking crevices in the shaft wall, sifting through the meager contents of a rotting wooden crate that held Josiah's tools. It was Clara who found it. She noticed a large, flat rock near the mine entrance that was oddly out of place. It was heavy, but with Eli's help, they managed to lever it aside. Beneath it, wrapped in a piece of oilskin to protect it from the damp, was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a full map, but a torn fragment of a geological survey, with Josiah's own frantic charcoal markings drawn over it. It depicted the network of tunnels inside his small mine, but at the very back of the main shaft, he had sketched a crude symbol and a note. The symbol was Ag, Argentum, Silver. The note was barely legible. Vein runs north, at least 20 feet thick, behind the false wall. Clara stared at the drawing, her hand flying to her mouth. It all crashed into place with the force of a physical blow. The debt collector, the escape plan, the fear in his last letter. Josiah hadn't been running from a simple loan. He had stumbled upon a fortune, a massive, untapped silver lode, right under the nose of the powerful men who controlled the bigger mines in the territory. "He wasn't killed in a collapse," she whispered, her voice thick with a horrifying new understanding. "They killed him for this. He found it, and he wouldn't share it with them. So they killed him and tried to make it look like an accident. And now they think you know where it is." Eli finished, his expression grim. He folded the map fragment and tucked it securely inside his shirt. "Which makes you the only thing standing between them and a mountain of silver." Their return to Redemption Gulch felt different. The danger was no longer a shadowy suspicion. It had a name and a motive, and it was waiting for them. 4 men had ridden into town while they were gone. They were not locals. They were hard-faced and carried themselves with the predatory stillness of wolves. They drank at the saloon but didn't speak to anyone, their eyes constantly scanning the street. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man with a florid face and cold, calculating eyes. Clara recognized him instantly from the town's 4th of July picnic the year before. Rance McGraw, the former foreman of the Consolidated Northern Mine, the company that owned nearly every claim in the county, except for Josiah's small, independent plot. McGraw and his men saw them ride in. There was no mistaking the look that passed between them, a flash of recognition, of assessment, and of pure, undiluted menace. The threat was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was sitting in the saloon, drinking whiskey in broad daylight. The next 2 days were a war of nerves. McGraw's men were a constant presence. One of them would follow Clara to the general store, standing across the street, just watching. Another would appear at the far end of the street whenever Eli was working on the shelter for his horse. They never spoke. They never got too close. They just made sure their presence was felt, a constant, suffocating promise of violence. It came on the 3rd evening. Eli had gone to the land office to finalize the purchase of his parcel of land, a small act of faith in a future that was growing more uncertain by the hour. He was walking back as dusk bled across the sky. The main street was quiet. He passed the narrow alley between the blacksmith and the livery stable. It was a classic ambush. 2 of McGraw's men stepped out from the shadows. Eli didn't even have time to reach for his pistol. A 3rd man came from behind. There were no words, just the brutal, efficient sounds of a beating. A fist to the gut, a heavy boot to the ribs, the sickening crack of knuckles against bone. It was over in less than a minute. They weren't trying to kill him. It was a message, delivered with methodical cruelty. They left him slumped against the wall in the darkness of the alley. It took him a long time to get to his feet, every breath a fresh agony in his chest. He managed to stumble out of the alley and toward the flickering lamp in Clara's window, leaving a trail of blood drops in the dust behind him. Clara threw the door open before he even reached it. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. His lip was split and bleeding. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming over his right eye, and he was holding his side, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Eli!" she cried, a raw sound of terror and fury. She helped him inside and eased him into a chair. She ran to get water and a cloth, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the bowl. As she began to gently clean the blood from his face, the full, terrible reality of their situation settled over them. This was not a story. This was not a distant danger. This was the price of his standing with her. "My ribs are just bruised," he rasped, wincing as she dabbed at the cut on his lip. They were thorough. Tears of rage and despair streamed down Clara's face. "This is my fault," she whispered. "They did this because of me, because of what Josiah found." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "You have to leave. Eli, they will kill you. Get on your horse and ride away from here. Don't look back." He reached up and caught her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He held it against his chest, forcing her to look at him. "And go where, Clara?" he asked, his voice low and intense despite the pain. "Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? I told you, I'm done running." He took a ragged breath. "This isn't about Josiah's silver anymore. This is about a pack of bullies who think they can take whatever they want. It's about you and me." In that moment, she saw the truth of it. His love wasn't a gentle, comforting thing. It was fierce and unyielding, a shield and a weapon. He wouldn't leave her, even if it meant his death. And she knew, with a certainty that cut through all her fear and guilt, that she could not let him face it alone. To send him away would be a betrayal far worse than any ghost could accuse her of. They didn't back down. That night, as he rested in her bed, his breathing shallow and pained, she sat in the chair beside him. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was no longer her master. "When you came here," she said softly into the darkness, "I was already gone. I was just a ghost living in a dead man's house. You saw me. You brought me back." He turned his head on the pillow, his good eye finding hers in the gloom. "Josiah is gone," she said, the words both a final, painful goodbye and a declaration of a new beginning. "But I am still here, and I choose to be here. With you." It wasn't for the town. It wasn't for a wedding ring or a public declaration. It was a promise made in the quiet, desperate hours of the night, sealed by the shared reality of blood and pain. It was their own choice, forged in the face of death. He reached out his hand from the bed, and she took it, her fingers lacing through his. "You and me, then," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You and me," she answered, her grip tightening. "Whatever comes, the annual town fair was meant to be a day of reprieve, a fragile truce with the hardships of daily life in Redemption Gulch. The air, usually thick with dust and despair, was instead filled with the smells of roasted corn and candied apples, the sounds of a traveling fiddler, and the laughter of children. It was a day the town allowed itself to pretend it was a community, and it was into this pretense that Clara and Eli walked, a deliberate and defiant act that brought the celebration to a screeching halt. Eli was still healing. A livid bruise shadowed the side of his face, and he moved with a stiff, pained grace that hinted at the agony in his ribs. But he stood tall, and his hand rested possessively on the small of Clara's back. Clara, for her part, met the stunned and hostile stares of the townspeople not with fear or shame, but with a cool, unwavering gaze. Her hand was linked in Eli's arm, a simple gesture that was as loud and shocking as a gunshot. They were together. They were unashamed, and they would not be broken. The crowd parted before them, a sea of shifting expressions. There was shock, raw and undisguised, on the faces of Mrs. Gable and her friends. There was open contempt from the men who took their cues from Rance McGraw and his crew, who stood watching from the steps of the saloon with mocking smirks. But there was something else, too. In the eyes of some, a flicker of doubt, a grudging respect for a display of courage they themselves did not possess. The town that had been so unified in its condemnation was now fractured, divided by the silent, powerful statement of the two figures walking through their midst. They stopped at a stall to buy lemonade. The simple, normal act a stark contrast to the tension crackling around them. It was there that the first stone of the old lie was finally dislodged. An old miner named Silas Blackwood, a man with dust in his lungs and decades of fear etched into his face, had been watching them. He saw the way Clara looked at the battered man beside her, a look of fierce, protective love. He saw the smug arrogance of Rance McGraw, the man he knew was responsible for Josiah Thompson's death. For a year, Silas had held his tongue, terrified of what McGraw would do, but seeing Clara's courage, he found a last, withered shred of his own. He shuffled over to a small group of his fellow miners, his hands trembling. "It ain't right," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "What they're doing to that woman. What they did to her husband." "Hold your tongue, old man," another miner warned, glancing nervously toward the saloon. "No," Silas said, a new strength in his voice. "I'm an old man. I'll meet my maker soon enough, and I won't do it with a lie on my soul." He took a shaky breath and spoke the words that had been poisoning him for a year. "I was there, the day the mine collapsed on Josiah. It was no collapse. I saw it. I saw Rance McGraw argue with him at the shaft entrance. I saw him shove Josiah. Shoved him hard. He went over the edge, screaming. Rance just stood there and watched him fall. Then he kicked a few support timbers loose to make it look right." The confession fell like a boulder into the quiet pond of the town's willful ignorance. The miners around Silas stared at him, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. The story, a truth too dangerous to speak, was finally out, and like fire in dry grass, it spread. Within minutes, the entire fair was buzzing, the whispers now not about Clara's morals, but about murder. The news reached Rance McGraw like the tolling of a bell. He pushed himself off the saloon steps, his face a thunderous mask of fury. His reputation, his power, was built on fear. An accusation like this, left to fester, would be the end of him. At the same time, a fellow miner rushed to tell Eli what Silas had said. The confrontation was inevitable. It happened at the edge of town, where the main street dissolved back into the unforgiving wilderness. Rance and two of his men stood waiting. Eli, handing his glass of lemonade to Clara, walked to meet them. The townspeople followed, forming a wide, silent circle, a captive audience to a play that had been a year in the making. "You've got a big mouth, old man," Rance sneered as Eli approached, gesturing back toward Silas, who stood half hidden in the crowd. "He just told the truth," Eli said, his voice calm. He stopped about 20 paces from Rance, his hand hovering loosely near the Colt at his hip. "Something you know nothing about. Josiah Thompson had an accident." Rance spat, his hand creeping toward his own gun. He was a clumsy fool who got what he deserved, and this town would be a lot better off without his widow and the drifter she's hiding behind. "The only thing this town needs to be without," Eli said, his voice dropping, "is a back-shooting coward who murders a man for his claim." That was it, the final insult, the undeniable challenge. The world seemed to hold its breath. The fiddler's music had long since died. The only sound was the wind, whipping dust into little cyclones around the men's boots. Clara watched, her hand over her mouth, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. This was her fault, his fault, their fault. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the man standing alone for her, for the truth. The draw was a blur of speed and violence. Rance, overconfident and enraged, went for his gun first, but he was fueled by anger, and his movements were clumsy. Eli was a different creature altogether. His motion was fluid, economical, born of a grim necessity learned in places far harder than Redemption Gulch. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. The roar of the pistol was a physical blow, a deafening crack that echoed off the hills. A puff of dust erupted from Rance's chest. A look of complete surprise crossed the foreman's face before his gun had even cleared its holster. A second shot from Eli's gun took one of the other men in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. The third man, seeing his boss fall, lost his nerve and fled. But Rance, fueled by pure malice, managed to fire a single wild shot as he collapsed. The bullet caught Eli high in the side, a fiery, tearing impact that spun him around. For a heart-stopping moment, Eli remained standing, his gun smoking in his hand, a lone figure of righteous victory. Then, his legs buckled, and he crumpled to the ground. The spell of silence was broken. Clara screamed his name and ran. She didn't care about the gasping crowd, about the whispers, about propriety. She flew across the dusty ground, her world narrowed to the sight of him lying in the dirt. She fell to her knees beside him, gathering him into her arms. Blood was already soaking through his shirt, a dark, spreading stain. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "Eli," she sobbed, brushing the hair from his sweat-soaked forehead. "Eli, look at me." His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on her face. A weak, pained smile touched his lips. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned down and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that was desperate, fierce, and full of a love that had been forged in fire and fear. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his. "You listen to me, Eli Vance," she whispered, her voice trembling with a ferocious intensity. "You are not going to die. If you live, I will be your wife. I swear it. I'm not afraid of them anymore. I'm not afraid of anything but losing you." Her words, a raw and public vow, washed over the stunned townspeople. They saw the blood. They saw the dead man who had terrorized them. And they saw the woman they had scorned, clinging to the man who had fought for her, offering him the only thing she had left to give. Her promise, her future, her heart. In that moment, the old, comfortable lies crumbled to dust. They had judged the wrong person. They had been blind. And now they could see. Later, after Eli had been carried to the doctor's small office, his life hanging by a thread, Clara walked to the one place she had been so afraid to enter. The church was empty, cool and silent. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She walked to the front and knelt at the altar. But the words that came were not the ones she had expected. She did not ask for forgiveness for the night she had spent with Eli, or for the public spectacle she had just made of herself. She had done with shame. "Forgive me," she whispered to the silent, vaulted ceiling, her voice echoing in the empty space. "Forgive me for the year I spent in darkness. Forgive me for the fear I let rule my heart. Forgive me, for I have chosen love, and I will never choose fear again." For 3 days, the world was a narrow, suffocating space defined by the 4 walls of the doctor's office and the shallow, ragged rhythm of Eli's breathing. Clara never left his side. She lived in the chair beside his cot, a silent, sleepless sentinel. She bathed his fevered brow with cool water, moistened his cracked lips, and changed the bloody bandages on his side, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. The town, in its own clumsy way, tried to atone. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, left a basket of fresh bread on the doctor's doorstep without a word. Silas Blackwood, the old miner, brought a jar of what he claimed was a potent herbal remedy for gunshot wounds. Even Reverend Miller came, hat in hand, and offered a quiet, humbled prayer, not for Clara's soul, but for Eli's life. Clara accepted their offerings with a detached, distant grace. Their repentance was a distant noise. The only sound that mattered was the weak, fluttering beat of Eli's heart. On the 4th morning, as the sun cast long, golden fingers into the room, she was wringing out a cloth when she felt his eyes on her. She looked up, and he was awake. His gaze was clear, the fever gone, and it was fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry, cracked rasp. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. She dropped the cloth and took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "You're back," she breathed, the words a prayer of thanks. "Oh, Eli, you're back." His recovery was slow and arduous, but he was alive. And through it all, Clara was his constant shadow, his anchor to the world. She fed him broth, read to him from a tattered copy of Shakespeare the doctor owned, and simply sat with him in a silence that was more intimate than any conversation. In the quiet crucible of his healing, their bond, already forged in violence and defiance, was tempered into something unbreakable. The ghosts of the past faded, burned away by the simple, powerful reality of the present, the need to live for each other. They were not married in the church. Its walls, which had once echoed with their condemnation, felt alien and cold. Instead, they chose a place that belonged only to them. On a warm afternoon a month later, when Eli was strong enough to stand without wavering, they walked to the edge of the land he had bought. There, an ancient, sprawling willow tree stood, its long branches weeping gracefully toward the earth, creating a small, sheltered cathedral of green. Their guests were few, but they were the ones who mattered. The town doctor, who had pulled the bullet from Eli's side and marveled at his resilience. Old Silas Blackwood, his face scrubbed clean, his eyes bright with a pride he hadn't felt in years. And, surprisingly, the blacksmith, a quiet, formidable man who had never uttered a word against them and who now stood as Eli's witness, his large, calloused hands clasped respectfully before him. There was no organ music, only the gentle rustle of the willow leaves in the breeze. There was no fine white dress, only Clara's best calico, and no suit, only Eli's clean shirt and trousers. "Reverend Miller," his voice humbled and sincere, "read the vows." When it came time for the rings, Eli took Clara's hand. He had no gold to give her. Instead, he produced a simple, narrow ring he had painstakingly braided from the tail hairs of his horse. Dust Devil, a symbol of the journey that had brought him to her. He slipped it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Clara, in turn, gave him no ring. She simply placed her other hand over his, her touch a promise more binding than any medal. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said, his voice thick with emotion. Eli looked at Clara, his wife, and saw in her eyes not the haunted widow he had first met, but a woman of incredible strength and boundless love. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed their past and opened their future. It was not a grand affair, but a quiet, profound moment of grace, witnessed only by the wind, the sun, and the handful of souls who understood the true meaning of redemption. Their life together began with the raw materials of the earth. They did not move into Josiah's old cabin, with its sad ghosts and painful memories. They built a new home, a small, sturdy house on Eli's land, with their own 4 hands. Eli, his body still mending, could not do all the heavy lifting, but he was a skilled carpenter. He showed Clara how to measure and saw the pine logs they felled, how to notch them so they would fit together, snug and tight against the winter winds. She, in turn, learned quickly, her hands, once delicate, becoming strong and capable. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their shared labor a dance of sweat and determination. The rhythmic thump of the hammer, the rasp of the saw, the quiet murmur of their voices. These were the sounds of their new world. They raised the walls together. They laid the floorboards side by side. They built a large stone hearth that would become the warm, beating heart of their home. While Eli worked on the roof, Clara broke the hard ground for a garden, planting seeds that were a stubborn bet on the future. They were not just building a house. They were building a life, a fortress of their own making against the harshness of the world. The town, for its part, watched them with a quiet sense of awe. The story of the widow and the gunman had become a local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of quick judgment. The silver in Josiah's mine was eventually claimed by a large corporation, its riches hauled away to distant cities, leaving Redemption Gulch no better or worse than it had been before. The real treasure, the townspeople slowly began to realize, was not buried in the rock, but was being built, board by board, on the hill overlooking the town. Their first winter came early, blanketing the landscape in a deep, silent shroud of white. The wind howled around the corners of their small house, but inside, a fire roared in the stone hearth, and the air was warm and filled with the smell of baking bread and pine smoke. One evening, as twilight painted the snow-covered hills in shades of lavender and blue, Clara stood by the fire, stirring a pot of rich venison stew. She wore a thick wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and the firelight danced in her hair. Eli sat in a chair he had built, mending a piece of tack, his hands moving with a familiar, easy skill. Outside the single window, snowflakes began to drift down, lazy and thick. Clara ladled the steaming soup into 2 wooden bowls. She carried one over to Eli, her footsteps soft on the floorboards. She placed it in his hands, her fingers lingering on his for a moment. He looked up at her, and the lines of pain and hardship on his face seemed to melt away in the warm light, leaving only a deep and abiding peace. He set the bowl aside and took her hand, pulling her gently onto his lap. She settled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and together they watched the snow fall, a quiet curtain descending on the world. "I wish I'd known sooner," he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "That all it takes to make the world go quiet is holding one person's hand." Clara smiled, a soft, contented curve of her lips. She turned her head and pressed a kiss to his cheek, the stubble of his beard rough against her skin. She thought of all they had endured, the loss, the loneliness, the judgment, the fear. They were scars they would both carry forever, but they were no longer open wounds. "We lost so much," she whispered, her voice thick with all the love her heart could hold. "But we still have each other." Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So drop a comment below and let's connect. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the old frontier. And feel free to share your thoughts on Clara and Eli's journey.